Developing academic language, how interesting. Yes, well, we're going to start with the comprehension hypothesis and a corollary of the comprehension hypothesis called the reading hypothesis. And the reading hypothesis says that reading counts as comprehensible input, of course, and I'll summarize the research like this. Reading, we now think, is the source of most of our literate development. Our reading comprehension ability, our ability to write with a reasonable and acceptable writing style. Wow, this means the way we teach writing is through reading. How do you like that? Real implications there. It's the source of most of our vocabulary knowledge. It's the source of our ability to handle complex grammatical constructions, most, not all, but most of our spelling ability, and a whole lot of other things. And there's one kind of reading that helps more than any other. And it's the reading that you did last night before you went to sleep. How many of you read last night before you went to sleep? How many of you, like me, read last night even though it was too late, you shouldn't have? This is reading addiction. The reading that really counts more than any other, we call free voluntary reading. Reading because you want to. No book reports, no questions at the end of the chapter. You don't like the book you're reading, you put it down, you pick up another one. Free voluntary reading, self-selected reading, is by far the most powerful tool we have in all of language education, and the most neglected. It's always the last resort. And occasionally it is absolutely disdained by the profession, but it's the only thing that really works. I want to start by giving you some of the evidence. I'm just going to update you on this. I've spent a huge amount of my waking hours putting together the evidence for reading. I've done books on it and papers. My best-selling book, The Power of Reading, my mom's favorite. She said, this one I understand. Anyway, that has data on it and all that. But I'm just going to update you and give you some of the more recent results that free voluntary reading does all these things. A study done by my colleague, Beniko Mason. Beniko Mason teaches a class in Osaka connected to the university. She's a professor there. English as a foreign language to adults, and it's set up pretty much like TPRS in many ways. The class is filled with storytelling. She uses a lot of Grimm's fairy tales, etc. And the homework is reading from graded readers, and there's a lot of them, so it's easy to do. When the class is over every year, so a few students say, we'd like to continue with you. Is there any way you can help us with our reading so we can get better? She said, fine, we'll do it. Under one condition, I keep putting this in the wrong place. Under one condition, two conditions. Keep track of what you read, and I'll help you find things to read, and take different versions of what's called the TOEIC test. The TOEIC test is a test that's very popular in Japan and Taiwan's test of English, and it's used throughout both countries very widely. In fact, in Japan, companies require that you have a certain TOEIC score or they won't hire you. And you've got to improve in the TOEIC by so many points in order to keep your job. They really have a bad case of TOEIC fever in Japan especially, although it's pretty heavy in Taiwan as well. There's this one guy in Japan who has too much time on his hands. He takes the TOEIC every year, gets 100% and gets his name in the paper. This guy doesn't know what to do with himself, let me tell you. Get a life. Anyway, the TOEIC is set up like this. The scale is 0 to 1,000, and 250 is considered this kind of threshold where you're intermediate, lower intermediate, and you get up into the 900s. It's a lot of academic English competence. You're pretty good. So we asked the students to do this. She did. And in a recent paper, Beniko and I put all her individual papers together and did some fancy statistics and determined what the average gain was in terms of hours read. Our conclusions: for every hour you spend reading whatever you want to read, you gain about a half a point on the TOEIC. They all read different things. It didn't matter. One guy, my favorite, a young man in his 40s, he read exclusively Harlequin romances. There's a guy confident in his masculinity. This is okay, in my opinion. The oldest subject was 76, pretty good. And it was consistent among other subjects. Well, we concluded from that, extrapolating, if you read an hour a day for pleasure, having a good time, you don't like the book, you put it down, you find another one, you can go all the way in 3 years from this intermediate all the way into the 900s. The easy way of developing academic language. Well, another study just came out, which I find particularly entertaining, done at the University of London. They have a team there that has been following the same group of people since they were very small children, and they're now 42. And every few years they intervene, they test them, and they announce, they do all these fancy statistics, give them questionnaires, et cetera. This time they gave them a vocabulary test. Native speakers of English. Here are the predictors of high levels of vocabulary. How much you're reading for pleasure now at age 42. Controlling for how much you read when you were a teenager. In other words, reading now counts. It's not that you've got to get it all done by age 7, age 8, age 10, et cetera, these myths that keep going through the profession. So if you're reading at 42 and you didn't read before, you can do very well. When I get to be 42, I'm going to start reading. That's going to be helpful, okay? In the United States, there is a push toward nonfiction brought to us by this horrible program called the Common Core, which I think is a tsunami that is going to destroy education worldwide by the time they get through. Let me tell you what I really think. I don't care. I'm retired. They can't fire me. I'm Professor Emeritus, which means not only not having to go to faculty meetings, it means not having to say you're sorry. It's wonderful. Anyway, they are pushing nonfiction, discouraging fiction, and I think there's one major reason for it. Nonfiction is easier to test and easier to make money on, okay? But you look at this data, it turned out that the more fiction you read, the better you are in vocabulary. Middlebrow fiction was a very significant predictor. In fact, a better predictor than nonfiction. The best predictor was highbrow fiction. Reading counted, the amount of reading counted, controlling for socioeconomic class of your parents and yourself, controlling for your education, your parents' education. In other words, this is a way of overcoming poverty. Children who live in poverty do poorly in reading tests. We'll talk about that later. Largely becomes they have very little access to books. Once they get access, they find a place to read, they find a chance to read, they do okay. How do you like that? Well, so these are the correlational studies. We also have studies of the effect of free voluntary reading in school, otherwise known as sustained silent reading, or SSR. By the way, in the States, we used to call this USSR, uninterrupted sustained silent reading. We don't do that anymore. Anyway, in sustained silent reading, you take a few minutes out of the day and the children get to read whatever they want to read with zero or no testing to see how much they've read, zero or no accountability. Very nice. We trust the children's brains. They don't have to do tests, they don't have to do book reports, etc. Now, generally this is done 5, 10, 15 minutes a day, a little bit each day. We have to find out if this works. For a very good reason. I have calculated, if you're a teacher and you do sustained silent reading once a day with one class, 10 minutes, over a normal teaching career, this amounts to 3 months paid vacation. Teaching's hard enough. We have to find out if this works. Well, the studies have been going on for a long time, and they're all set up the same way. One group does sustained silent reading, the other group does skill building, which means classical language arts instruction, grammar instruction, reading instruction, read the paragraph, answer questions. It's been done with English as a second language. There's been one foreign language study that we know of done with Japanese, in fact. And you see which group makes the greater gains. The results are consistent. The most negative result with very few exceptions, no difference. They make exactly the same gains. Now think about this. Which is easier for the students, reading what you want to read or doing skill building exercises? Let me repeat that. Did you get the question? Which is easier for the kids? Reading. Which is easier for the teacher? Reading. So if there's no difference in test scores, which is better? Reading. You not only get the same level of language development, but it's much more fun, much more relaxing, and you get so many things that are not on the test. The studies that show no difference are in nearly every case short-term studies. Some as short as 3 months, 10 weeks. I have seen sustained silent reading programs, and I now know what you know. The first couple of weeks, nobody's reading. They haven't found a book yet. You give the program a chance to run, the readers are consistently better. I found the cutoff to be about an academic year. You let it run an academic year or longer, the kids do better. I'm going to show you one study because it's my favorite. This is a study published in the Reading Research Quarterly. And one of the main reasons I like this study is because of the Reading Research Quarterly. If you know the reading journals, you know that the Reading Research Quarterly is the #1 snob journal in reading. Most of the articles in this journal are long, dense, and nearly completely incomprehensible, which is why people think it's the best journal, okay? These are studies written to get published, not written to be read, okay? Does that make you feel a little better? It's always dreadful when I get a copy of the journal. Oh God, do I have to read this? All right, it's hard to stay awake. Anyway, that's where this study was published, which is wonderful. And the authors are our friends. Warwick Ellie from New Zealand, Francis Mangubhai from Fiji, who are among the best in the world at this. Warwick Ellie is one of these great heroes. People on both sides of the aisle really respect Warwick Ellie. If you go to the reading conferences, he's been the president of this, the director of that, published this, published that. So he's a very good guy, heroic. They did the article, Fiji Islands, English as a foreign language. In the Fiji Islands, English is taught to everybody starting at kindergarten, 30 minutes a day. And in this study, Ellie and Mangubhai looked at the children in grades 4 and 5. They were divided into 3 groups. One group got the audio-lingual method, which to me is a combination of everything that's wrong in language teaching combined into one method. And of course, it's the most popular method in the world. The second group got sustained silent reading. Here are the books, boys and girls. Enjoy 30 minutes a day. Not bad. Now, they could understand the books. They had had English since kindergarten, and the books were reasonably comprehensible. No book reports, no nothing. The third group got a program that Ellie and Mangubhai called Shared Book Experience. We call it Big Books. The children are read to from very large books. They could see the print. They discuss the story, and they do self-selected reading. I'm now going to give you the gains in reading on standardized tests after the first year, second year. Before I do this, let's review what we've got here. We've got the Reading Research Quarterly, the most conservative and prestigious journal in the world on literacy development. This was not published in the International Communist Party newsletter, okay? Number 2, Ellie and Mangubhai, top scholars. Number 3, standardized tests. Everything the harshest, most critical person would ever be asking. I'll give you the gains in terms of months gained. We expect native speakers to gain 10 months in a year. Let's see what happened. This is on the handout, but don't look at the handout. Let me present it to you. It's much more fun this way. Audiolingual, 6.5 months gained. Sustained silent reading. Take a deep breath. Maybe you better sit down. Oh, you're sitting. This is a number that will change your life the way it changed mine. I'm not making this up. This came from the paper. 15 months gained. Could you please gasp with astonishment? Thank you. Not even close. Big books, 15 months gained. Audiolingual, fifth graders, a pathetic 2.5 months gained. Sustained silent reading, a modest but respectable 9. Big books, 15. The readers were better. They were not only better in reading, they were better in writing, listening, and grammar. The second year of the project, this 9 disappeared, and the 2 reading groups were even farther ahead of the audiolingual group. This study came out in 1983, and it's one of hundreds and hundreds of studies showing exactly the same thing, all published in the professional journals. The next chart on your handout happened the day I discovered how to do Excel. So it's kind of showing off. It's an article I did in a journal that's free. Journals should be free, open access, okay? Let me make a political statement here for a change. My whole attitude toward publishing changed about 6 years ago. I was invited to contribute an article to an edited book called Input Matters. Isn't that nice? And I did my article on comprehensible input, and I put a lot into it, okay? One of the big companies published it. I won't mention their name, Multilingual Matters. And I worked hard on it. It was a long paper. I don't usually write long papers. And I talked about comprehensible input, the reading hypothesis. I had a whole section on animal language, whether animal language fit the comprehension hypothesis. I had a long footnote on what to expect from aliens when they land from Zeta Reticula, unless they're already here, when there is some evidence for that. In fact, my favorite researcher, McKenna, says they're already here and they've come in the form of magic mushrooms. And if you eat one, they'll talk to you, okay? I put that in too. So I had this great paper. The book came out. I have to state this in dollars, but you can make the transition. It sold hardcover for $160 American dollars. The softcover edition was a bargain at $65. I don't know about you, but I can't afford to buy books like this. I couldn't afford to get copies at discount for being a contributor. I checked other books by the same company. One of their books, the irony was lost on them. It was called Education in Poverty, and it sold for $160. And I found the other companies were doing this too. Not all of them, but a lot of them. They're outrageous amounts of money. And I checked with people, and I discovered why. They have a captive audience in university libraries. And they're going to make a profit because they're charging so much money. Well, I then looked at how much I was spending, not just on books, but on journals. I can't do it anymore. I don't know anyone who can. If, like me, my research goes in several areas. So I was in bilingual education organizations, ESL, literacy, all this stuff. And I realized that everything was way out of control. And I decided it's time for a change. What I do now, and I can do this because I don't care about promotion and tenure anymore, my articles now go into open access journals, which are free. Free, and they might charge a contributor $25 or so, 15 pounds or so. Big deal. That's so they can meet their expenses. Fair enough. But it's free for someone to read it. We started one around this time, the International Journal of Foreign Language Teaching, IJFLT.com. That's where this article came out. Also, all my books and articles, well, all my articles, I'm trying to get put on my website, sdkrashen.com. Download them. It's free. You don't have to ask me permission. You can use it for any reasonable purpose. If I ever write another book, I don't know if I will or not, but if I ever do, everything's going to be available on the website in some form or other. May I please have a round of applause for me? So there, okay? So this has got to end, this business. are being ripped off by publishers. The mathematicians are doing this now. A petition was signed by 1,000 mathematicians, including my son, that they are no longer publishing in the expensive journals. It's all going to be open access. Isn't that wonderful? Harvard University has stopped ordering journals. The British government puts aside money for scientists to pay publication costs so they can publish in the open access journals. Every field is doing this except education, and especially in English language studies. The TESOL Quarterly, all these groups, Applied Linguistics, are still charging big bucks. The problem is if you're a junior professor, you got to publish in these journals, or you don't get credit for it, et cetera. That's not true in other fields, and I think one way working against this is for people, at least like me, to keep publishing in these open access journals. So that's where this is. What this is a summary, what we call a meta-analysis, of studies done with English as a foreign language in countries where English is not the language of everyday communication. I looked at high school age and college age students. On the left is the list of studies, and you can find it in the journal, it's right there. And this is Japan, Taiwan, Yemen, Singapore, et cetera. Well, Singapore is kind of middle case there. In each case, one group got traditional instruction, and the experimental group had sustained silent reading for at least, some amount of time. The last two columns are the results. Closed test, CLOZE, that's where students, high school students, are given a paragraph. You have to fill in the missing words, and it turns out to be an excellent test of English. It's a lousy pedagogical activity, in my opinion, but it's a good test. The last column's reading comprehension. The numbers there are what are called effect sizes. I'll tell you what that means. If the effect size is positive, the readers did better. Look at the columns, they're all positive. In every single study, the readers did better than the comparison students who simply had more skill building. That's pretty convincing. If the effect size is 0.2, 0.3, it means there was a small difference. It was a small effect. 0.4, 0.5, it's a modest effect. 0.8, 0.9, it's pretty big. Again, for both of you who remember statistics, I'll tell you what it means. An effect size of 1.0 means the experimental group was one standard deviation better than the other group. Okay. The average effect size I computed in different ways, between 0.4 and 0.7. In other words, this works. It works in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. It works with first language. It works with second language. It works everywhere we have been trying to look at it. I want to supplement this with some more data, case history data. Case histories are a great way of doing research, in my opinion. The important thing about case histories, the important thing about case histories is to do a lot of them. If you just do one, you don't know what factors were crucial. So these are just samples. First case history, and these are both, first one's English as a first language, second language lesson. Liz Murray wrote a best-selling book called Breaking Night, and it describes her own life story. Grew up in heavy, heavy poverty in the New York area, and eventually did well in school, went on to Harvard, and there was a made-for-TV movie about her. Very interesting. Her dad had a very interesting habit. Living in the New York area, the New York Public Library system at the time, the branch libraries were not connected by computer. Each library was their own independent unit. So Dad would go to a local library, get a library card, and take out all the books he could and never return them. Then he'd go to another local library, take out all the books. Soon the house was filled with fugitive library books from all over the city, which he read and his daughter read. She said, Liz Murray said that she went to school, elementary school, grammar school, only the last couple of weeks to see what was going to be on the examinations so she could, get through it. Here's what she says. Any formal education I received came from the few days I spent in attendance, mixed with knowledge I absorbed from random readings of my or my daddy's ever-growing supply of unreturned library books. As long as I still showed up steadily the last few weeks of classes to take the standardized tests, I kept squeaking by from grade to grade. Children of poverty, the ones who make it, have a supply of books. It's hard for them to do it, but they manage to do it. They're the ones who succeed. Anyone who thinks that comic books are bad for you should look at the life of one of the noblest people who ever lived, Bishop Desmond Tutu, Nobel Prize winner. Here's what he says. One of the things I'm most grateful to my father for is, contrary to educational principles, he allowed me to read comics. I think that's how I developed my love for English and for reading. Okay, we've seen the evidence that free voluntary reading is good for literacy development, helps you do better on these tests, get by in school, etc. Not only is it good for you, it's a lot of fun. The next segment you see on the handout, the extreme pleasure of self-selected reading. One of my favorite books was written by a South African psychiatrist, Victor Nell, who I think now lives in London. It's a great book called Lost in a Book. Here's what he says. Part of the book is he interviewed people who are dedicated readers. One person says, reading removes me from the irritations of living. For the few hours a day I read trash, I escape the cares of those around me, as well as escaping my own cares and dissatisfaction. He quotes Somerset Maugham, who was a very strange guy. Conversation after a time bores me, games tire me, and my thoughts, which we're told are the unfailing resources of a sensible man, have a tendency to run dry. Then I fly to my book as the opium smoker to his pipe. We're going to see this concept of reading addiction. There's a whole chapter in Victor Nell's brilliant book about bedtime reading. He asked people to come to his lab who are known to be dedicated pleasure readers, 26 of them, and to bring a book that they were involved in that they were loving. 13 of them brought The Power of Reading by Stephen Krashen. No, not true. Anyway, he said that they were dedicated nighttime readers. 24 out of 26 said they read nearly every night, most nights. Even if I read for only 5 minutes, I must do it, a compulsion like that of a drug addict. My addiction to reading is such I almost can't sleep without a minimum of 10 minutes, usually 30 to 60 minutes of reading. We can identify with this. He did this amazing study in which he found out what was going on with these people. He hooked them up to all kinds of devices to measure their arousal level up. This is galvanic skin response like they do in lie detection, respiration, perspiration, etc. He first got them to just relax and got their baseline arousal level. Okay? Then he had them start to read the book they liked. When that happened, their level went up. But when they put the book down, they relaxed below their baseline level. This explains why people are so dependent on reading. Your homework assignment is to write a paper comparing this to sex, okay? Okay, you can do that on your own. Well, okay, so reading is not just good for language development, it's extremely pleasant. It also makes you smarter. It develops knowledge. Now, the research I'm going to give you is based largely on reading fiction, not on reading nonfiction. For example, Keith Stanovich, University of Michigan researcher, has done a series of studies giving readers questionnaires and tests of knowledge, and they're all known to be fanatic pleasure readers. People, if you ask them about their reading, it's mostly fiction. Victor Nell found that 2/3 of the books taken out of libraries are fiction. That's what people read. Nonfiction is fine, I'm all for it. I just don't want us to neglect fiction. Very, very, very important for all levels of our development. I looked at the New York Times list of bestsellers for young people. 10 out of 10, nonfiction. This is the core, 10 out of 10 fiction. Oh, I got that wrong. People who read more fiction know more about literature, that makes sense, more about history, more about science, how do you like that? More cultural literacy, more practical knowledge. Readers are not nerds. They know more about everything. There is a clear correlation, and I think it's causal, between having a reading habit and career success. My favorite researcher in the area of creativity is a guy named Dean Keith Simonton, University of California at Davis. His conclusion: omnivorous reading in childhood and adolescence correlates positively with ultimate adult success. Csikszentmihalyi and his colleague Emery, they looked at a group of men, all of whom grew up blue-collar working class. One group, half of them had access to books, the other didn't. The ones that did not have access grew up to be working class, had working class jobs. The ones who had access to books, professionals. What a difference. Malcolm X. Did you see the movie, the Malcolm X movie, Spike Lee? I liked that. I thought it was a really good movie. I thought Denzel Washington was a better Spike Lee than, Denzel Washington was a better Malcolm than Malcolm was in the movie. It's more convincing. The movie was good, but it neglected the part on reading, which is there in the autobiography of Malcolm X. He talks about his life story. He grew up in the Middle West in Michigan. When he was in 7th grade, he was the president of his class. But then he said the family moved east. And he said, my life in the streets erased everything I learned in school. He got in trouble with the law, was sent to prison. In prison, he met what sociologists call a significant other, another prisoner who introduced him to the prison library. He became a fanatic reader. He said, you couldn't have gotten me out of books with a wedge. Nighttime, when the guards came by to see if you're in your cell, he was under the cover reading. My favorite quote, he said, not long ago, a reporter called me wanting to know about my life story. He said, what's your alma mater? I told him, books. Finally, Michael Faraday. Remember Michael Faraday from your studies of science? One of the greatest scientists who ever lived, chemist who basically discovered electromagnetism, one of Einstein's heroes. Well, Michael Faraday grew up in London, child of poverty, left school when he was 10, went to work for a bookbinder. The bookbinder changed history. The bookbinder said to Michael, while you're working here, you're my apprentice, I want you to help me with the work, but take some time off. It's okay. Read the books. Michael Faraday became a fanatic reader, and he read fiction. He read Aesop's Fables, 1001 Nights, all those things. Gradually, as he read, he realized what his interests were. He got interested in science. In his early 20s, he got himself apprenticed to one of the top chemists in England. When he was 26, he published his first paper, the first of many, in which he changed the world in chemistry. Michael Faraday never studied. Michael Faraday never took a test. He did the two things that I'm beginning to think are the core of successful education: free voluntary reading and getting involved in solving problems that you think are important. Whether you succeed in solving them or not, those are the things that count. I like now, armed with this background knowledge, to talk a little bit about the development of academic language, which is, of course, our obsession now in English. We want our students, and I think it's a worthy goal, not just to get conversational English, but to move up to more sophisticated forms of language. In North America, this was stimulated by the work of Jim Cummins of Canada, who made the point very vigorously at the end of 1970s, and I think it's absolutely correct. Our way of helping kids do academic language, though, is to describe it and to teach it. Find out what the academic vocabulary is of chemistry and teach the vocabulary of chemistry and teach all the rules of chemistry, etc. I think this is hopeless. I'm announcing the death of English for academic purposes. I don't think it works. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that I think is a huge waste of time and money. There is an easier way. I have to apologize before going on for my use of terminology. I'm uncomfortable with the term academic language because it sends the message that we want everyone to be college-type people, okay? And to have the language of great literature and science and the arts. No, what we really want is specialized language. I think I can easily criticize my own government. It's my responsibility. The push now is to make kids college-ready. The Common Core standards in American schools are college prep. The English standards are for English majors. The math standards are to train you to become an engineer. And if you're not doing that, if you haven't done pre-calculus, you're a failure. No, I think we have disrespected the trades, the artisans. A former cabinet member, John Gardner, in the Clinton administration, had this to say: if we praise mediocre philosophy and we disdain competent plumbing, neither our theories nor our pipes will hold water. We have gone far too heavy into the college line, and we've ignored the vocations. We used to have these classes in our secondary schools of electricity, shop, plumbing, all these things. We don't have them anymore. The United States has convinced the media that we have this huge shortage of science, technology, engineering, and math. And we have to vigorously train people in mathematics, engineering, computer science. There's a pressure now that you can substitute 1 year of the language requirement if you take programming, okay? Have you suffering under the same STEM fever? It's a hoax. Every serious researcher who has looked at this, and their articles and studies have found that there is absolutely no shortage of engineers. There's no shortage of technically trained people anywhere. There are lots of them. In fact, there's a surplus. There are too many. There's no shortage of engineers in North America, that's for sure. Computer science, no shortage of programmers. There are a few little areas in computers so they could use more people, but the real shortages, electricians, elementary school teachers, construction workers, and plumbers who will have jobs long after the current computer phase, after everything changes in computers and all today's programmers will be obsolete, okay? So having said this, let's go back. I'm going to make this claim. Here's how we develop specialized language. I'm going to suggest a 3-stage model, and I'm going to give you case histories as we go. And I'm going to claim this is universal and that you've gone through it. Some of you have gone through it in 2 languages. I'm going to claim this works for first language and second language, and I'm going to claim it's not only the easy way and the most pleasant way, I'm going to claim it's the only game in town. First stage, stories. Children who are read to at home, children who are read to at school, always do better on nearly every test you give them on language than kids who haven't been read to. The logic is simple. When you hear stories, you hear a higher level of language. You get the special text structure, special vocabulary and grammar of the written language, and you get excited about books, and you want to read on your own. In the United States, we owe a great debt to a guy named Jim Trelease, Trelease. Have you heard of the Read Aloud Handbook? Wow. This book is now in its 7th printing, and it has popularized reading aloud to kids throughout the country. I'll tell you how good this book is, the Read Aloud Handbook. My perfect mother, oh my, I am my mother's son, 100%. My sister and I talk a lot about Mom all the time and how wonderful she was. I have no complaints about my mother. She was in my office one day and she picked up a copy of the Read Aloud Handbook. She took it home with her and she read it. Her comment was, "Stephen, why can't you write like this?" I said, "I wish I could. It is absolutely wonderful." The research supports this, not only the studies I just mentioned to you. There's a group in the New York area called Reach Out and Read. Here's what they do. They visit hospitals in high poverty areas, and they find families who are there for a well-child checkup. In the waiting room, a team reads stories to the kids, and they explain to the parents how to do it, a few simple things. When they go in to see the pediatrician gives them one free book, one trip a year, maybe 3-4 books total. you see profound differences in their vocabulary development. They close about half of what we call the achievement gap just by being exposed to books this way. Inexpensive, costs nearly nothing. Well, I'll give you my case history. It's the case history I know the best. I would love to present you a case history which shows how I overcame great obstacles. But I can't, because I had it easy. It's too bad. It would be much more exciting. But I had it easy. Between lives, you meet with your committee of spirit guides and people you've reincarnated with. You've read about this. And they decide what your next incarnation is going to be because of what lessons you have to learn in your spiritual development. I don't remember the meeting, but they gave me a free pass on this one, let me tell you. I grew up in a middle class, upper middle class neighborhood with nearly a complete absence of any family pathology. Mom and Dad were great. Books all around, they were both readers. They read to me. We had books in the home. Let me tell you about my sister. I will never understand my sister. My sister's older than I am. I will never understand her because she's always been so nice to me. I never do anything for her. And she's always worried about me. She read stories to me, got me involved in radio stories, and when I tell you the next thing, I will ask you to give her a round of applause. When I was 9 years old, my sister, who was 12 at the time, took me to the local public library and got me a library card. Is that cool? Yes. So I had books everywhere, no problems. I couldn't miss. The next stage, stage 2, is a stage of wide free voluntary reading of things you like, self-selected. On its own, it isn't enough. This is the bridge to higher forms of language. This makes it possible. Years and years of reading what you want to. I went through this. I gave you the research for it. I'll give you the case history, my own case. I went through 3 sub-stages in this time, starting around age 9 or 10. I got involved with comic books, and it was my dad's doing. Hold the applause. I'll tell you why. I want you to give him a round of applause in a moment. Even though I was a good reader in school, everyone else was a good reader too, because it was this, middle-class neighborhood, and all kids were privileged and had lots of books around. So I was not in the highest reading group. I was kind of in low mediocre. And Dad decided to do something about it. He brought home comic books, and he gave me an open budget for comics throughout my entire childhood. He said, buy all the comics you want, I will pay for them. Yes. Now, and that made the difference. I immediately shot up to the highest groups within a couple of months. My reading got much, much better, even though it was okay. Now, in those days, this was in the 40s, comics were okay. We had Batman and Superman and a guy named Captain Marvel. I don't know whatever happened to him. I think he's coming back. And it was fine. Not as good as today's comics. Oh, wow. The comic book world changed in 1961 with the beginning of the Marvel comic book company. Stan Lee, who brought us superheroes with problems. And the introduction of the most important person, I think, in English literature, Spider-Man. No question, absolutely changed everything. Today's comics are much better. How many of you are currently comic book readers? How many of you were ever comic book readers? Take a look. Take a look at graphic novels, what they're doing now. I'll tell you a little bit about them. I'll give you a couple of recommendations for graphic novels, in fact, and I'll mention some DC products, the other company, in order to be fair. I recommend you start with Batman Returns, 20 years ago, Frank Miller. Batman is now 56 years old. He still goes out and fights crime, but he's on his own. He's now Dirty Harry. He has his own ethical standard. He doesn't pay attention to Commissioner Gordon anymore. He doesn't look for the bat signal. He decides who he's going to wipe out and who he isn't and why. He has his own standards. It's still a little hard for him, though. Robin has gone off to college. So he's doing this all on his own. And he's 56, man. So he comes home, he has to take aspirin, have a hot bath. Now it's Advil, but in those days, ibuprofen. And Superman and Batman are still friends, but they have different philosophies. A lot of mutual respect, but they still talk. And there's this great conversation in Batman Returns between Superman and Batman. If it were put out today, they'd be meeting at Starbucks, I think. Anyway, Batman, as I said, has his own philosophy. Superman is traditional. He says, if the police commissioner tells me to do something, I do it. The law is my guideline. Batman says, sometimes the law isn't right. The comic does not take a position. The comic, what it does is expose the biggest ethical problem, or the most universal problem we all have, our personal code versus society's expectations, the law, authority. It's not easy to decide when you break the law or if you ever should. It's a struggle. By the way, Marvel contributed to this in the movie Iron Man 2, which was my favorite of the Iron Man series. If you recall the movie, in the opening scene, Iron Man, Tony Stark, very well played by Robert Downey Jr., is called to a meeting of the U.S. Senate, a hearing, and the U.S. senators say, you know, you've got this Iron Man thing, you're flying around the world blowing things up and all that. This is a dangerous weapon. You can't have it, you got to turn it over to the military. Citizens can't do this. Robert Downey says, look, I'm doing what you guys should be doing. There's all this evil stuff going on, and I'm taking care of it. So, you know, get to work. The movie does not take a position. What it does is present the dilemma for discussion. And it is an unsolvable problem, and it's something we all face all the time. Another book, another graphic novel you might want to look at, also a DC product, is called The Watchmen. It was made into a movie, and it's from a quote from Cicero, who's watching The Watchmen? If we have superheroes, who is making sure the superheroes are doing the right thing? In other words, do we want a benevolent dictatorship? That is the discussion. It does not come to a clear conclusion. It presents the ethical problem. So these graphic novels are fulfilling the goals of literature. They present ethics and how we should live, etc. After comic books, I moved on to sports stories, and I specialized in baseball. The work of one author, John R. Tunis, who wrote this amazing series, all with a mythical baseball team, the Brooklyn Dodgers, with his own characters. And it wasn't just about baseball. It was about the players, their problems, their frustrations, overcoming obstacles, etc., their ethical crises all the time. The best one was the last one. I hope some of you understand a little of American baseball. I'll try to make it clear. It's called World Series, and it's the last game of the World Series. The World Series is the American version of the World Cup. We call it the World Series, even though it's the United States and one Canadian team. I mean, a little bit of arrogance here. Okay, come on. It's not the World Series. It's you and the Montreal team, that's all. Anyway, it's the final game of the World Series. In the World Series, it's the first team to win 4 games, playoffs. And it's the last one. Each team has won 3 games each. It's the final part of the game we call the last inning. The score is very, very close. The next play is going to decide it. The pitcher, the guy who throws the ball on one team, is the father. The batter is the son. And they haven't spoken for 15 years. That's good writing. You'll have to read it yourself to see how it came out. After baseball, I moved on to science fiction, and this was the golden age of science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, all these wonderful writers. Robert Heinlein before he went crazy. His early stuff was wonderful. After that, I don't know. He need to change his medication, I think. This was my curriculum in high school. This is what made me literate. I studied literature, in 9th grade. We did American literature, 10th grade British literature. And I took tests on all these things. I don't remember a single book. There was this one author, Shakespeare something, I don't know, it's all very vague. I remember everything I read on my own, every single one. I've gone back and read a couple since then. My son and I went through a Robert Heinlein phase a couple of years. We read them all through again, discussed them. And they're still good, they're still wonderful. This did not bring me to the highest levels of literacy. This was the bridge. Sustained silent reading, free voluntary reading is the bridge that makes harder reading more accessible. Necessary, but not sufficient. I got to the point where I could read academic stuff in graduate school, when I finally found what I wanted to study. Linguistics was the closest thing to what I'm doing now. Let me tell you what happened. I took my second class in linguistics called syntactic theory. The required text was Noam Chomsky, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. I tried reading it. It could have been written in Bulgarian. I had no idea what it said. Here's what I did. I went back and found Chomsky's first publication, Syntactic Structures, written 15 years beforehand. It was clear, because it was his first publication. It took me a while, but I really liked it. I loved syntax. Then I went on to his next publication, and his next, staying in strict chronological order, and reading what his critics said and how he responded to them. 1 month later, I tried Aspects again. It was completely comprehensible. I read all of Chomsky. And I don't know Noam Chomsky. We're not pals, although our names are sometimes linked in all these discussions. I met him once. It was at USC. He came and gave a talk at my university. I met him, shook hands, and I said, "I'm Steve Krashen." He said, "Who?" That was it. But Chomsky was my teacher, no question. I learned basic linguistics by going through this reading program. That was my conscious goal. Without realizing it, I learned how a scientist thinks, and I started to acquire academic language without realizing it, because I was so absorbed. It was compelling for me. In each stage 2, in all 3 stages, the input was compelling. In stage 2 and 3, it was narrow, and it was self-selected. That's how it happens. It's the only way it happens. It's the only thing that ever sticks. It cannot work any other way. It cannot be taught. The system is too complicated. Just take vocabulary, for example. The average educated speaker of English knows anywhere between 50,000 and 150,000 words, depending on how you do the research. Bilinguals will know 250,000. That's not 50,000 trips to the dictionary. 50,000 draw a line from the word to the definition. It simply cannot be done. It has to be absorbed. The syntax is too hard. The text structure is too hard. People who've tried to do discourse analysis and text analysis and all this have come up with blindingly difficult descriptions of how texts are. It cannot even be understood, let alone taught. It is absorbed through reading. It doesn't happen through classroom instruction. Douglas Biber has done analyses and has found that the language of classrooms is closer to conversational than it is to academic. It has to come through reading. It doesn't come through content-based instruction, even though I think it's somewhat of a help. It has to come through massive amounts of self-selected, narrow reading. I will close this by stating the obvious. If this is true, what do we do in school? Let me tell you what Frank Smith says about this. Frank Smith, who has been my inspiration in so many ways. He says we have the student's brain and we have school. Which one can we change? Thank you very much.